Daniel had just stepped out of the corner store when the sound of sirens cut through the night, sharp and urgent, the kind that made people stop and look even before they understood why. He stood there for a moment with a paper bag pressed against his chest. The weight of milk and bread, nothing compared to the weight of the morning ahead of him. Tomorrow was his interview, the one he had circled on his calendar and then erased and circled again, afraid that believing in it too much might somehow make it disappear. As a single father, hope had become something he rationed carefully. His daughter Lily was spending the night with the elderly neighbor down the hall, so Daniel could review his notes and sleep without interruption. And for once, the apartment felt quiet in a way that didn't hurt. Then he saw the smoke. It curled out of the windows of the old brick building across the street, thick and dark, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of burning wood and something chemical that stung his nose. People gathered fast, voices rising, some shouting names, others frozen in place as if their bodies had forgotten how to move. Daniel dropped the bag without thinking and ran. He didn't remember deciding to do it. His feet simply carried him forward, driven by a force he recognized all too well. The same instinct that made him get up every morning, no matter how tired he was. The same instinct that had kept him standing when Lily's mother walked out and never came back. Flames licked the inside of the building's ground floor windows, and the heat pressed against his face as he pulled his shirt up over his mouth and pushed through the doorway. Inside, the air was heavy and black, each breath burning his lungs as he moved by memory more than sight, counting steps, keeping one hand on the wall. He heard coughing somewhere above him, faint but unmistakable, and he followed it, taking the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the way his heart hammered in his chest. On the 3rd floor, he found her collapsed near the hallway railing, her hair spread across the floor, her body frighteningly still except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. For a second, fear rooted him in place, the terrifying thought that he might already be too late. But then she coughed weakly and his body surged back into motion. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt, and turned back toward the stairs as the heat intensified, the walls cracking and groaning around them. Every step down felt longer than the last, his arms burning, his vision narrowing to the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other. Somewhere outside, sirens grew louder. But Daniel didn't slow down until he burst back into the night air, collapsing onto the pavement with the woman still in his arms. People rushed forward, someone yelling for space, someone else wrapping a jacket around her shoulders. Daniel sat there, gasping, his hands trembling as he finally let go. The woman was taken away in an ambulance before he could say a word to her, before she even opened her eyes. He stood there long after the fire was under control, watching the building smolder, his clothes smelling of smoke, his mind slowly catching up to what his body had done. By the time he got back to his apartment, it was past midnight. Lily was asleep on the couch under a blanket, her thumb in her mouth, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that grounded him. He carried her to bed and sat beside her for a long time, listening to her breathe, feeling the aftershocks of the night ripple through him. Sleep came in fragments, filled with images of fire and falling walls. And when morning finally arrived, it felt too soon. Daniel dressed quietly, smoothing the wrinkles out of his one good shirt, tying his tie with hands that still felt unsteady. He told himself the exhaustion would fade, that adrenaline always did, and that this interview mattered more than anything else right now. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he had no idea that the night he thought was already behind him was about to follow him into the one place he believed was still under his control. Daniel arrived at the office building earlier than necessary, choosing a bench across the street where he could sit and steady his breathing. Before going inside, the city looked ordinary in the daylight, as if the fire from the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream, and he almost convinced himself that it didn't matter, that whatever he had done would fade back into anonymity, the way most things in his life did. He replayed his answers in his head, adjusted his tie again, and finally stood, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and responsibility settle into his shoulders. The lobby was quiet and cool, a sharp contrast to the heat and chaos he still felt under his skin. When his name was called, he followed the receptionist down a hallway lined with glass offices, aware of how out of place he felt in his slightly worn shoes. The interview panel greeted him politely, their expressions professional and unreadable, and Daniel answered their questions with a focus born of necessity, talking about reliability, problem-solving, and commitment, words that carried more meaning for him than any resume ever could. Halfway through the interview, the door opened softly. Daniel glanced up out of habit, expecting an apology and a quick retreat, but instead he froze. The woman who stepped inside was unmistakable. Even without the soot and smoke, even standing upright and alert instead of unconscious in his arms. Her hair was pulled back neatly, a faint bandage visible near her temple, and for a moment their eyes met with a recognition that sent a quiet shock through him. The room seemed to hold its breath. She spoke calmly, introducing herself to the panel, explaining that she needed to add context to the candidate they were currently interviewing. Daniel's heart pounded as she turned toward him, her gaze steady and filled with something he couldn't quite name. She told them about the fire, about waking up trapped by smoke, about the footsteps she heard when she had already begun to believe no one was coming. She described the arms that lifted her, the voice that told her to hold on, the stubborn refusal to let go even as the building groaned and burned around them. Daniel sat there, heat creeping up his neck, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to look away. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She simply told the truth, and somehow that made it heavier. When she finished, the room was silent again, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. One of the interviewers cleared his throat and thanked her, and she nodded, offering Daniel a small, sincere smile before leaving as quietly as she had entered. The rest of the interview passed in a blur. Daniel answered a few more questions, shook a few hands, and found himself back outside before he fully understood what had happened. He stood on the sidewalk, the morning sun warming his face, and wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. His phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor saying Lily had woken up asking for him, and the familiar pull of his real life snapped everything back into place. He went home, made breakfast, and listened to his daughter chatter about a dream she'd had, grounding himself in the routine that defined his days. Hours later, a call came from an unknown number. Daniel answered with a cautious hello, bracing himself for disappointment. But instead, he heard congratulations, followed by words that took a moment to sink in. The job was his. He thanked them, hung up, and sat there in stunned silence as Lily climbed into his lap. Sensing the shift in his mood, that evening there was a knock at the door. Daniel opened it to find the woman, from the fire standing there with a small paper bag in her hands, her posture tentative but her eyes warm. She thanked him again, this time without an audience, her voice softer, more personal. They talked briefly, awkwardly at first, about the fire, about recovery, about how strange it felt to see each other again, under such different circumstances. Lily watched them with open curiosity, and when the woman knelt to greet her, something in Daniel's chest loosened. As the door closed behind her later that night, Daniel leaned against it, feeling a quiet sense of balance settle over him. The fire had taken something from many people. But it had also revealed something he had almost forgotten about himself, that even when life reduced him to survival, he still had the capacity to step forward, to choose courage without knowing what it might cost or give back.